So I love to add some action or movement to my food photography, really helping to make the image more dynamic, draw the viewer in. But I found myself recently getting a little bored of sort of the predictable actions, right? Like I've done lots of pouring the maple syrup over the pancakes and plenty of pouring the creamer into the coffee. But how can I go beyond that, sort of push that envelope to the next level in terms of movement and action? So that is what we're going to go through here today. 3 different ways you can take your movement and your action to the next level. What's shaking bacon? I'm Joni Simon. Welcome to my studio. This is where I do food photography, and the goal here is to improve your food photography skills so you feel confident behind the camera. Like I mentioned, today we are going to be playing with action and movement in our food photography, but in those more unpredictable ways that I have looked to some inspiration from other food photographers, some of my absolute favorites in the industry, people who continually inspire me, pulling out some of my favorite cookbooks and seeing how different photographers have incorporated action that are not the typical, not the predictable ways that it can inform the compositions that we're creating, strengthen our images, and take it to that next level. But before we get there, I am excited to share with you that today's video is sponsored by Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes for creative and curious people. Explore new skills, develop existing interests, and get lost in creativity. Now, it's curated specifically for learning, meaning there are no ads and they're always launching new premium classes so you can stay focused and follow wherever your creativity takes you. Now, a recent favorite of mine is Video for Instagram, telling an engaging story in less than a minute. Halis Narvaez is a digital storyteller, video producer, and I love that she gets at the heart at what makes great video content. It's the story and how to cultivate that visually with things like framing, cinematography, but as well as tangible editing skills, tools, and methods, but in a way that you can do it without needing any fancy gear. All you really need is a phone to bring someone into the story that you want to tell. Now, when you join, you can try one of Skillshare's live classes and experience real-time inspiration as you connect with popular teachers while watching and working along with the other members. So whether you're a dabbler or a pro, a hobbyist or a master, you're creative. Discover what you can make with classes for every skill level. And good news, the first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare so you can start exploring your creativity today. So thanks again to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Now let's get into the action. So like I mentioned, in thinking about action and movement in food photography, taking it to the next level, thinking about it in maybe a way that we haven't thought about it before. And some of this being inspired by those of y'all who've been reading my book, Picture Perfect Food. And on page 50, I talk about using implied movement to hook the viewer into the image. And I've been seeing some amazing shots over on Instagram. Thank you so much for tagging me and sharing those with me. It's so exciting to see y'all digging into this action and movement. And I thought, well, how do we take that one step further? Like, what else have we not explored in this topic? Because I always think too about anything that we've done before, how can we think about it from a beginner's mindset? Come at it from that perspective of what else have I not uncovered in this thing that I have done before? So that's really sort of the mentality that I approached action and movement in re-exploring this specific topic. So what I did, one of my favorite things to do, is to go into the inspiration of other food photographers whose work inspires me and some of my favorite cookbooks out there. And I have quite a cookbook collection. I went to the cookbook collection and just started pulling different ones off the shelf and thumbing through, looking for action shots, but action, like I said, in that unpredictable, more nuanced way. And lo and behold, it only took me a couple cookbooks worth to get through some of my favorite titles from some of my favorite food photographers and went, oh, that's a really cool way to use movement. I hadn't thought of that before. And so idea number 1 came from Every Day is Saturday by Sarah Copeland, photographed by the incomparable Gentle and Ayers. If you're not familiar with their work, I highly recommend doing some research, digging into it. I own quite a few cookbooks that include their photography, and it's just continually inspiring. So this image here was one that I thought was particularly smart and thoughtful and made me think differently about the way that we incorporate action into a scene in terms of the composition and in terms of the framing. That this particular image, you can see we've got the Hungarian snacking tray, and of course the colors are gorgeous, the lighting, the texture, everything's beautiful. Also the incorporation of the child being a part of the overall story being told in this book, it's absolutely beautiful. But what I love is that the direction of that reach is mirroring the orientation of this image and that very severe vertical crop. This is a very vertical image, right? It's been cropped up to an aspect ratio that's very tall. And so the child reaching through the frame in that vertically down direction makes it feel like, you know how kids when they reach and they go, oh, you can just barely get to it, right? Like you could almost feel the strain happening in this scene, that we get that feeling because it's accentuated because of the framing and because of the composition of this scene. That it would feel very differently if the child was placed at the right of the frame and reaching in from that longer side, that we wouldn't feel that same sort of stretch feeling. So thinking about how does your crop, how does the orientation of the image accentuate or play into the action that you're incorporating into the scene. And so using what this image is teaching us and thinking about future action shots that I'm going to take is considering, okay, well, do I have a specific aspect ratio or do I have a specific orientation that I'm shooting an image? And generally we do, because we know where that image is going. You know, if it's for Instagram that we've got something vertical, or if it's a website header, you know, it's probably horizontal. And so thinking about, okay, what's that aspect ratio? And if I'm incorporating action into that, what direction is the action going to happen? Should I modify that? Should I change that in order to accentuate that action or make that action more dynamic or express a certain feeling? And I think that too, understanding what is that feeling we're trying to communicate with this action. This particular movement in action is making us think about being around a table with children and with our family and thinking about that perspective of a child trying to reach for something. I think too, it's interesting that the child was placed at the top of the frame as opposed to the bottom of the frame, because I think that we personally, as the viewer, identify with the bottom of the frame, that we would be positioned personally there in that seated position at the bottom of the frame. And so the child being opposite of us makes that relationship feel, you know, connected and makes it feel natural, as opposed to if the child's hands was reaching in from the bottom of the frame. How would that change the image? And so to me, this is like that next level of intentionality when it comes to composition and framing. How do we ensure that the action that we're taking is going to convey the emotions and the feelings that we're trying to communicate, and how does that strengthen the view of that action? So idea number 2 came from one of my favorite cookbooks in my entire collection, both because of the photography as well as because of the recipes. The all butter pie crust in this cookbook is literally like the only pie crust recipe you will ever need in your whole life. Like it's perfect. I wouldn't change a thing. I use it all the time. Comes from Art of the Pie by Kate McDermott, photographed by my friend Andrew Scrivani, who many of you probably already know. If you don't, I linked the information of all these folks and all these books down in the description box below, so go check that out. But I adore Andrew, I adore his work. And so one of the images in this book that made me stop and think about action and movement differently, and I've seen Andrew do this before, and I think it's such an effective technique, is that we don't have to freeze our action, right? We always get so excited, and again, for a good reason, that when we pour those splashes shots and we can freeze that action in like perfect crisp stillness, right? Like that's a really cool effect. But sometimes that motion, that movement is better communicated as blurry. So here on page 53, we have this pie, and I love sort of this action of the brushing, that the hand is blurry, that the brush is blurry, but we know what it is. In the context of this scene and this story, we know that we're applying that egg wash to the top of the pie, and it just adds sort of this different feeling, this different energy to the scene. And Andrew does this a lot throughout this book and a lot throughout other work that he's done. It was one of those things that I all of a sudden realized, I was like, oh, that is a really cool technique. And maybe you're wondering, okay, well, what would I need to do in order to create an image like that? Like, how do we get the pie frozen and still, but then we get the hand moving? So I went ahead and set up a scene, because honestly, it does not take a lot of encouragement for me to bake a pie, and there are fresh cherries all over the grocery store. So I thought, okay, let's make a cherry pie. So I went ahead and recreated this image. But before I had the pie all baked and ready to photograph, I did some test shots just to show you how you might want to do this differently depending on what you like best. But really it all comes down to our shutter speed. So in this particular setup, I am shooting in natural light, got a south facing window here in the studio, and then I have got the camera rigged overhead on my C-stand. This is going to be helpful, especially if you're shooting by yourself, because you're going to need your hands in the scene. So having some sort of tripod or overhead mount. If you want information about my C-stand setup, all that jazz, I've got that linked down below. And then the other important tool for me for this setup, because I am shooting by myself, I'm going to be the hands and the photographer all in one, is then having a remote shutter release. So the ability to fire the camera to take a picture without having to touch the camera. So I've got my favorite little Yongnuo set. It's a wireless set. I've shared about this in other videos. I'll link the info about that as well down below. But so pretty much having that camera anchored up in the scene, having the natural light coming in, having my trigger, then it's just a matter of playing around with the different shutter speeds. And because the camera is in a fixed position and the pie is not moving, the pie will continue to be still. But then depending on how slow I take that shutter speed, I can increase the look of that drag. So you can see here at 1/60th, we've got a little bit of blurry going on, but you can still definitely see the hand defined and the brush. But then we slow it down to 1/25th of a second, we're definitely getting a lot more blur. And then slowing all the way down to 1/10th of a second and even slower, that's adding to even more blur. Now there's no particular one that's like the better one to go with or the right one to go with. To also the consideration of the speed of that action, like if you move your hand slowly versus moving your hand quickly, and what direction you move the hand in. So definitely if you're going to recreate a shot like this or attempt this sort of action in motion look, you're going to want to experiment with different shutter speeds, doing the action differently and seeing where it lands for you, what look you like the best. I will also say this is a really great technique if you don't have a great manicure. Like my manicure is like 3 weeks overdue and I'm like, oh, it's no problem. We could just make that blurry, no problemo. Now, one other thing about the movement in this image that's incredibly effective is going back to that same idea of what we talked about in the previous photo, is the idea that the action is going along with the lines in the image and the direction that the image is flowing. So if we look at kind of the overall lines that are being established here, that we have this pretty strong diagonal going from the upper left to the lower right? You just look at kind of the direction of that bowl in the lower left, and you've got some of these other little, crumbs up here in the upper left, and also just the direction that the light is coming in from, right? We've got these strong diagonals coming on here. We kind of enter the scene from that upper left, especially too if you're a Western viewer and you read left to right. We generally approach images from the same way that we read, and this is, created for a Western English-speaking audience. And so we're coming in from that upper left side of the frame and following then where the hand, you can see that the hand is moving in that same diagonal, right? We can see the direction of the brush, we can see the direction of the action. And so we've got this helpful little kind of on-ramp into the image, bringing us in through those little pieces of extra pie crust in the upper left. And then we're drawn to, of course, the star of the show, the pie, right there dead in the center. But then the hand kind of draws the viewer, and then suddenly we find ourselves swept up into this circular motion because we see sort of that direction that the hand is moving in, and the eye is going to continue to follow that. The brain is going to continue that action, and suddenly we find ourselves kind of in this loop around that pie, which is incredibly effective for keeping a viewer locked into the scene. That anytime we can create a composition that causes somebody to linger longer, helps keep somebody captivated, that is an effective image, especially in this day and age when attention spans are so short. If we can keep somebody engaged through an effective composition, that's definitely a win. And like I said, the all butter crust recipe in this cookbook is to die for, and this actual cherry pie in this final image, best cherry pie I've ever made in my life. Like, I feel like this was a major milestone for me. And then the third idea for how to change up our game when it comes to action came from Jamie's 30-minute meals, photographed by David Loftus. Many of you are probably familiar with David and his incredible work, always inspiring. Any of these photographers who you're not familiar with, highly, highly recommend seeking out their work, checking it out. You will undoubtedly be inspired. But one of the images that grabbed me and made me think, the action does not always need to be the center of attention. It doesn't need to always be the focus of the image. So case in point being these vegetables here in the sink, in the colander, and that we have the water running. And the water is certainly like involved and it's something we notice, but it's not the star of the show. The veggies are. But having that running water kind of in the periphery, also not in focus and also blurry, not in crisp, sharp action, that it's creating this atmosphere and this feeling that's very approachable, that feels very much like home, which fits with the story being told in this book. And two, going back to the idea of the action being an important part of the composition, is that as we look at that running faucet, that is sort of, then we've got this symmetry going on then with the direction of the vegetables, that then it's creating sort of this V, which is a really strong line, but then our eyes then kind of bounce between these two pillars, right? We've got this side over here with the vegetables, we bounce between that. Again, keeping the eyes in the frame going between these two items, these two strong lines that are created in this image. I also really, really love, and maybe one of my favorite parts of the whole image is actually the water that is underneath the colander, that you already know those little drips are happening, right? Those little splashes are happening. We're seeing those ripples. It's such a small detail. It's such a little thing, but it's why David Loftus is the genius that he is. It's just those little details that communicate the larger picture and the atmosphere that make this feel like you are there or that you want to be there. But now, like I said, don't let this deter you from those high voltage, like splashes and crashes and action shots and freezing the motion and all those things that we love adding to our food photography, that those are absolutely still effective and incredible and so much fun to create. But if you're looking to add a little bit more nuance, to think outside the box, do something different, think about these three different tactics, these three different techniques, how you may want to incorporate them into your future action shots. And so with that, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much to the photographers who photograph these gorgeous cookbooks and all of the food photographers out there who create images that inspire us. You all rock our world. And so with that, you stay out of trouble, and I'll see you soon. All right? Bye.